We know that even we say violence against women, it should be clear that's a men's issue, right? We saw those stats on perpetrators. We know that the majority of where this comes from is one, not Native, and two, not women, right? And yet it's women, Native women, who are often doing the work. And so I think just like making sure the reframe of where the accountability lies is important.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guests are the founders of the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Alaska Working Group. Those founders are Kendra Kloster and Charlene Aqpik Apok, who will be referred to by her Inupiaq name, Aqpik, throughout today's interview. The Missing Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Alaska Working Group is an Indigenous-led consortium that is supported by the partner organizations Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, Alaska Native Justice Center, Alaska Native Heritage Center, Data for Indigenous Justice, and Native Movement. Kendra and Aqpik began meeting in 2018 and continue to meet weekly to share communications, strategy, actions, and community building to address the MMWIG2S crisis in our state. According to the National Institute of Justice, Native American women are more than twice as likely to experience violence than any other demographic. The numbers are higher in Alaska, but exact reliable data is lacking, and this is one of the issues we will be discussing today.
Kendra Kloster and Aqpik, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start by having you each introduce yourself and learn a little bit about you. So we'll start with Kendra.
Right now, I currently work as the co-director for law and policy at the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. I also wear some other hats where I sit on the statewide MMIP commission and am part of the MMWIG2S Alaska Working Group, which is 5 Indigenous nonprofits where we have come together since 2018 to work on just addressing this crisis of MMIP and how we can bring an end to violence together as organizations. I also come as a mother of 3 children. I'm Tlingit Raven Kiksauti, originally from Wrangell and Juneau area, though live here on Dena'ina lands, raising my children. And really what brings me to what I call this heart work is this is not a crisis I want to be passing to other generations. And now I don't want our Native people to be unsafe, and all Alaskans really, because what we do here and the work that we're doing for Indigenous women is good for all Alaskans. And how can we make Alaska a safer place? So I work with Aqpik daily on how we can do this together. So I really appreciate that we can do this in community.
Did you grow up in Wrangell?
I grew up between Wrangell and Juneau. So I was born in Wrangell, but I went back and forth a lot on the ferry. And so I've been in Anchorage for a little over 10 years. But yeah, mainly grew up in Southeast.
Did you graduate from high school in Juneau?
I did.
Which high school?
From Juneau Douglas. We only had one at the time. There's now 2, but nope, I grew up and everybody funneled into one high school.
And you went on to work in the legislature.
Yes. So right after graduating from college in Durango, Colorado, I actually moved out to Washington, D.C., and I worked for Senator Ted Stevens for about 2 years. And then I decided it was time to come home, and I missed fishing and all of that, Alaska things. So I came home and I actually worked in the Department of Law for a little while, and then moved over to the Alaska legislature where I worked for 10 years in both the House and Senate, majority, minority, it was all over the place. And then after that, I moved to being executive director for another Native nonprofit, Native People's Action, and then moved over now to the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center.
And what did you study in college?
Business and literature.
And I guess with the business and literature degree, how did it seems like the big transition and things fell from there was going to work for Ted Stevens in DC.
To be honest, when I was 17, I did the close-up trip. And when I did that, it had a real impact on me. And I knew I actually wanted to go there at that age. And so after I got out of college and I said I really wanted to work in policy, I know I have business and literature degree. It's just what I really enjoyed. And So I brought that knowledge from what I gained there and brought it to DC. And I just really bugged Senator Stevens' office until they hired me because that's where I wanted to be. I just knew that's what I wanted to do. And then when actually some staffers that were working in Juneau came to the DC office and working for Senator Stevens, I was talking with them and I was like, wow, their job sounds really cool. They're doing similar but different things. And I really love policy. So that's why I decided to then come home and start making my way there. But when I was working at Department of Law, I was watching gavel to gavel and helping writing briefs and stuff like that. And then as my time there, they noticed how much I liked policy. So they would let me work on legislation and whatnot. And so finally I just moved across the street to the legislature. But I really found a love of policy because that's where I feel like I can help make a difference and make a change. So I did go out and get a master's in policy after that as well at UAA. But it's just an area that I really actually enjoy working in. I'm a giant nerd. I like reading statutes. It's weird, but everyone has their love of different things. Thank goodness Aqpik likes data. So we all can nerd out in certain ways. So I just felt like that's where I could really make the difference. And being in the legislature is, you get to see lots of different people, learn lots of different things, and, pass legislation to try to make a difference.
At what point did MMIP come on your radar or be something that you started to focus on?
I would say when I came out of the legislature and I started working for an Indigenous organization with Native Peoples Action, and that's more when it came on my radar. And I think it's when I was in the legislature, you do what your bosses have your focus on and whatnot. And at the time, it wasn't talked about a lot. I don't recall a lot of presentations, or we didn't have the Tribal Affairs Committee.
Where did you start in the Alaska
gosh.
State? I guess just to give listeners for like a frame of reference.
This was at least 16 years ago. So when I started, I have to really think back when I started.
2008-ish.
Yeah, so it's been a while. But the other thing is, one of the reasons when leaving the legislature, I was getting a little frustrated that I wasn't seeing a lot of Indigenous representation and a lot of people just being there. And it was interesting. I'd have those conversations like, why are we seeing more Native people in the building? Why are we not seeing a lot of our tribes and whatnot? So that was a frustrating point that I talked a lot about. And so I think now, being where I'm at and learning all of the things that I've learned, if I were to ever go back in the legislature, I have a much different perspective on things. I worked a lot on public safety, military and veterans, and education issues, which are all still very important. But there's now this much more hyper focus. And I think that helped too by having these reports that came out, because that's what you want. You need the data and the information. So an Urban Indian Health Institute put out a report, and people started really talking about it. And that's one of the reasons we started the working group. Aqpik and I sat down over coffee, and out came all these ideas on how can we raise awareness and make this a big issue. So we have been working on this since 2018 when we started the working group of raising that awareness.
It seems off topic, but maybe it isn't. Can you talk about what you think the barriers are to more Indigenous people serving in the legislature or being in the building? Not even serving as legislators, but just being in the building.
I think there's a few different factors. Something I really try to work on is breaking down the barriers of sometimes when I talk to just people in general, oh, you should call your legislator about that. And they're like, oh, wait, no. And that just seems like you're almost like unapproachable. And I say our legislators are there to represent you, and they need to hear from you. And so sometimes they just don't want to make that jump where that seems like such an important position. We can't do that and can't bother them. And a lot of, I think, education and awareness that I'm trying to do, and all organizations are trying to do, is bring people to the Capitol to talk to your legislators so they understand what are the issues that are happening. I think part of that's a barrier. And it's just not a space. It's not a comfortable space for, I think, a lot of people and a lot of Indigenous people. You're going away from what you know. Our hunting, fishing, gathering, being in community, being out on the land, and really coming into the legislature it's a big jump. And getting up into this red tape. And I think that's a difficult place to maybe want to be in.
We're going to get to Aqpik really quick, and we're going to talk about some data. But one of the numbers that I came across that I thought was important to highlight is that we talk about rural Indigenous Alaskans a lot. You know that we have Alaska Natives living in rural Alaska, but we have a lot living in Anchorage. We have a lot living in Fairbanks. We have a lot living in our urban centers. And so I would think that the barriers to them serving might be different than those in rural Alaska. So I'm curious if you can speak to a little bit about why an Alaska Native who grew up in Anchorage may not want to serve in Juneau.
I'm just going to talk a little bit too from maybe some personal experience and thoughts too. This is something that people have talked to me a lot about, like, why don't you run for office? And I'm a Southeast person, but it's very difficult with having young kids and a family and knowing what the schedule is like there. And I have a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, and an 8-year-old. And that schedule is really tough to think about how I'm going to be there with my kids. And so I think that part of that's a barrier, the childcare aspect. So those, I think their barriers can be for families being there. And I think that's generally speaking. And when coming into Anchorage, moving from my community and coming into Anchorage was a really tough transition. One thing is, where in Anchorage are all the Alaska Native people? We don't have a focus area, right? This is where you live. We're spread out all over. And it took a long time to find that safe place with other Indigenous people. It took a long time. Honestly, probably not until I went to Native People's Action and worked with all these amazing. It was really tough to get into this type of community, into the Indigenous community, and I'm thankful now that I found this community, but it took a while.
Yeah, and I could see how when you're in Southeast and you're with your family, that's a very different experience than being in Anchorage and trying to find community when that's not like historically the way community worked in Alaska, maybe.
I just want to recognize too, Anchorage is still Indigenous people's lands. This is Dena'ina lands of many local Indigenous peoples and tribes, Eklutna, Chuklu nearby. And like what Kendra's describing too, like I remember moving home and also being like, okay, like
I just want to say to all listeners, Aqpik is talking now.
Oh yeah,
and
sorry.
Why don't we just start with your story?
So I was just jumping in.
Yeah,
Sorry
no.
about that.
So where did you grow up?
Yeah, so my family is from Gullivan and White Mountain up in the Bering Straits, so far away from where Kendra's from. We're from very different cultures. I grew up mostly here in Anchorage, and then I went to school out of state and then also returned home.
Where'd you go to school?
So I went to UW out there in Seattle, loved it.
What did you study?
I studied American Ethnic Studies and Gender, Women, Sexuality Studies. So I described that as a degree in power dynamics. And then I moved home. I also have my master's, and I did that in Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development. And I have a focus on health. I'm a researcher by training, so we nerded out in our lives in different ways. I became really passionate about research, particularly when I was given the language, because I was like, oh, research has this unfortunate, terrible history with many Indigenous communities, including ours in Alaska. But I was given the language of community-based research, and I was like, oh, and it was like a tool, I was like, to translate between community and research. And that really stuck with me. And so I became really passionate about research. And I worked at our hospital here in town when I moved home. And I really had a great experience with that, doing anything from behavioral health to pharmacogenetics research, and having that research then cycle back into the care that we provided here in town. And so that's my background, is in addressing health disparities of Alaska Native and American Indian peoples. And then I switched gears to also nonprofits, Indigenous-led nonprofits. In part, I was going back to school. I started my PhD program, and I really needed flexibility as a mother as well to be able to go to school and to keep working.
How old are your kids?
So I have a son, he's 8, and I just have one. Yeah. He's usually with me, though. Lots of people who know me know my son. And so when I started going back to school for my PhD, I switched to Indigenous-led nonprofits. There was a lot more flexibility. I could have work-life balance. And I felt like I could translate the work I was doing directly into programs, which I think is really powerful. A lot of times, if you continue to work in academia, it can take, I think there's studies on it. It says that there's 15 to 17 years between translation of work being done in academia into community. And that's just way too long for what we're working with.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but researchers are great at identifying problems, but implementing a solution to fix the problem is someone else's work, or that you're giving your study to the policymaker or the head of an organization to try to implement. And so I think there can be.
Yeah. And that was something too, like there's a very small amount, but a growing amount of strength-based and asset-based research, which was also, I'm grateful to have been a part of. Many of our communities are doing community-based research that puts forward their strengths and solutions, which is hard for Western research to understand, but there's a lot of really good work happening.
At the local level.
And I switched over. I felt like I could download information, analyze it, and then I could make a program and start doing community-based work immediately. And that's Kendra and I met. She's, hey, I heard you're doing something. And same thing, we joked that our whole working group started because we had coffee. But really, we were like, okay, let's do it. And we decided to keep meeting every week. And that's...
So White Mountain, Golovin is Inupiaq?
And some of them are also, there's Yupik. If you look on that Indigenous language.
St. Lawrence Island Yupik or Yupik?
Yupik. So if you look even on that Alaska Native Languages map that lots of people are familiar with, you'll see on Golovin, like the line literally goes right through
the middle.
And I was identified as Inupiaq, but then I remember recently in the last 5 years or so, one of my aunties was saying she remembered our grandma speaking Yupik, and it like blew my mind. I was like, what? So
2 things. Number one, I interviewed somebody a couple of months ago, and I learned from his book that Golovin is named after a Russian explorer. And actually the name is spelled differently, but the bay has a slightly different name. And then the bay is actually his name. What?
I don't know that history very well, but I will say recently my son was doing a school project and they asked like, where's your family from? And he said it beautifully. He said, I don't know how to say it in English.
Oh.
And so our Inupiaq ways of saying it is Nachirvik and Chinook. So
and
like,
so
I'll just share those.
And that's Inupiaq. Okay. And then my second question was about health disparities, since that was where you started. Can you just highlight some of the health disparities that you were working on addressing or documenting?
Yeah. So I've done a lot of projects. Gosh, it's hard to say shortly. So I guess like some examples are in suicide prevention, actually, and there's a lot of really good work. And I still work on some research projects because I love research so much. But there's a lot of suicide prevention that is trying to show our strengths as preventative factors and also like uplifting our protective factors in our communities, which in research land, again, is very different because oftentimes suicide research is looking at individual factors, risk factors, a very Western way of saying it's like an individual's fault. But we know very differently in our communities. And so there's strength-based work being done and community level being looked at because we all belong in a community, right? And that's some on the behavioral health side. And then I also worked in some genetics research, and mostly because I have pretty strong feelings about making sure our communities are safe when it comes to the practices of genetics and genomics research. And so there were some projects I worked on around pharmacogenetics, and then some with CPT1, which it's long to describe. It's not important to describe at all. But yeah, mostly trying to guide ethical DNA genetics research. And yeah.
back to the behavioral health and the suicide prevention. And I will disclaimer up front that I'm definitely coming from a Western perspective, but this is, and so I'm curious about you just commenting on it, maybe reframing some of this. But when I think about suicide in Alaska and the disproportionately high rate of suicide that we have, and that it's even higher the more rural you get, I think about alcohol's connection to that. I think about self-treatment of historic trauma. Can you comment?
Yeah. Two things that come to mind is first, like it's alcohol misuse, right? That's an issue. And that's, people don't want to talk about that because it's tied to money, like plain and simple. Follow where that goes and follow the money trail. And that's the issue. We see that across also like extraction industries and et cetera. And then the other thing that I would say about that is also, again, little known research, is that there's also really important research being done that shows actually how many Alaska Native people abstain from alcohol use. And that is less talked about. And how come? How come people don't want to say that or show that either? And so there is also a high abstinence rate as well for alcohol that people forget to say.
That's money. There's actually a very large percentage of the general population in Alaska that drinks less than one drink per month. But it's helpful for the alcohol industry to normalize higher rates of drinking because the more people drink, the more money they make. And so we don't hear about that.
Yeah.
I will make the segue to MMIP. Can
Sure.
you talk about how you first learned about MMIP and how you got involved?
Yeah. So before we had these acronyms and before the larger context of awareness, sadly, I think a lot of people have firsthand experience of missing and murdered loved ones in their families, including my own. So my mom was someone who passed away and her death was listed as suicide. But many people in my family strongly believe that she was murdered. She had been calling family members the week before she died, saying that she was afraid of the person she was seeing. And of course, it was just deemed as a person of color who...
Where was she living at?
So she passed away in California. And so that was something that greatly shaped my young adulthood and experience. And later in life, my little cousin was Samantha Koenig, the barista who was kidnapped and murdered here in Anchorage. And going through that with my family was really eye-opening as well into what these cases might look like. I have an aunt who also went missing out of state and was just deemed deceased because they never found her. So in lots of unfortunate ways, I think I've come to know this work before being able to have the words for it. And when Canada put out their report in 2016, I think that I lift them up in doing that because I think it showed the world something that we had all been experiencing for a long time.
First thing, I just want to say I'm really sorry about your mom and your cousin and your aunt. I'm really sorry.
Yeah. No, thank you. I share that, though, because a lot of times people say, oh, I didn't realize this, but actually I had this family member. And then they start to unfortunately see themselves as part of this woven story of an experience too common. So Canada put out that first report, and then all these timelines really start to come together. In 2018, Urban Indian Health Institute put out their report, and that was the first nationwide report that we had in Alaska was in there. And that was a huge deal as well. And it was at that same time that Kendra and I were meeting, that we had a rally at AFN, that families here started sharing their story, and that I started documenting and having our data.
I'll just read, this is from the National Institute of Justice report from 2016, which is different than Canada's story. But I just want to say that they found that more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women, 84.3%, have experienced violence in their lifetime, including 56.1% who have experienced sexual violence. I just think that number is just...
And there's decades of research that shows a history of violence here. I get all worked up when we have, quote, awareness months, right? I'm like, how much more... Also, I work in research and data, but I'm like, how much more research and data do we need before action is taken? It's infuriating, right? We shouldn't have to have any more numbers than even that We shouldn't have to keep asking these questions and doing research. We need action on it because it's so unacceptable. So I get really...
I'm going to point out one more
Yeah.
data point. 67% of assaults involve non-Indigenous perpetrators, because I think a common misperception and a way of ignoring it from a white Anchorage person is to say, oh, that's just something that happens in the villages. This is a Native issue. This isn't my issue.
I'd like to say something on that where...
This is Kendra speaking.
Violence was not part of the Indigenous way of life. This is not the way our history is of Native people. Women and men, they had a system of hunting, fishing, and gathering and really taking care of their children. And it was disrupted. It was disrupted in a huge way through colonization. It was disrupted when Native children were taken away from families and put in boarding schools. The amount of trauma put on Native people brought a lot of these issues into our homes that were not there. So it is an issue for all people, and understanding where that trauma is coming from, the trauma that was inflicted on our children, not only from being taken away from their families, the mistreatment that they saw, in addition to when they came home, or many of them who did not come home, then they didn't know how to parent because look at how they were treated. This was something that was done to Native communities. It is the responsibility of our state and everybody else to take action and just to understand that this is not our way of life. It never was. Look what was done to our Native people.
It's a learned violence from outside.
And I'm not trying to discredit like the history before that. I come from a Tlingit culture where we're very well known as warriors. But it's a different type of trauma and violence that was brought in, right? You're going to have the history of land wars between Alaska Native people, and I think that is another topic. But the one that I have brought up is you can't ignore that fact. You can't talk about some of the things that were done and ignore the fact of what historically happened. So I bring that up because I think it is important when we're talking about high suicide rates, when we're talking about trauma, when we're talking about all these things that people are saying, oh, that's rural Alaska. You have to understand the full history of it too, and not discredit and not talk about those pieces, like boarding schools and whatnot, and what's leading to missing and murder Indigenous women. This is something that has happened for quite a while, and now why are we talking about it? Because people, I think, now are more open. Like we're learning these things, and now we're having these data pieces, and it's not. And I'll just say it wasn't part of my family that I know about, right? It's not part of something in my immediate family. But when I started learning about this, and I'm going that this is something that we need to do and we need to address, there's so many issues that are layered on top of this. And that comes into a lot of talk about public safety. What does our public safety look like? And so we have that discussion a lot. And what's the state's responsibility to be providing public safety, and what's our own community's public safety look like? I just think that there's a lot of layers to things, and I just can't not talk about some of the trauma that was brought in when we're talking about MMIP and all that, because I think there's multi-layer of issues that are going on.
Some of these factors that we're talking about, this intergenerational trauma, particularly the boarding schools and removing children from their homes and basically destroying families, that's a risk factor for other issues such as poverty, being unhoused, these sorts of issues that in themselves become enormous risk factors for violence. So I don't know, maybe Aqpik, you can speak a little bit to that about how it's so multifactorial.
Yeah, I think, again, the way we talk about it is so important. We are not risk factors of our existence and history, right? There is active and targeted ways that we continue to experience many disparities. And so by being Indigenous, we aren't inherently carrying risk factors, right? We inherently carry a lot of also strengths and resilience and protective factors from our strong cultures and communities. But yeah, there's what people sometimes coin as social determinants of health. And again, trying to keep the language on a systemic, ongoing issue versus like individual people, I think is really important too. Because I think, again, we get to that slippery slope of having it come down to, oh, this person's choices. And so remembering systemic violence and this important historical context that we've experienced, and that greatly informs where we're at today.
And I want to take ownership of the way that I might speak about it. That
oh, no. Yeah.
Informed by colonial history.
No, I think it takes a lot of intentional ways to like slightly reframe. And
the issue that I wanted to move towards was, we know that the numbers that we talk about are extraordinarily high, but a lot of this goes unreported, particularly if it's sexual assault, domestic violence, not being reported. So the numbers that we have are probably most definitely underreported. And I think when we talk about, and again, I may get the language wrong, but an unhoused person is probably less likely to report violence done to them. An unhoused person is unlikely to seek out the police for whatever reason. And so I think talking about the very poor people who don't report, and that unwillingness to report, if the spiral effect makes them a more
targeted
likely victim.
Population.
Yeah,
they are. And we see that actually we've seen that in cases here in Anchorage of Alaska Native women who were murdered. There was a couple of years ago where there were multiple, right? And they're targeted because of those vulnerabilities. And if we have folks who are unhoused, we know that there's a lot of lack of mental health resources and care. And in probably many ways through their life experiences before getting to that point, the system showed that it wasn't going to provide the services and the things that they needed to be a healthy and well person. So I think by the time we're having folks become assaulted as unhoused people, they've already learned that they can't reach out and receive the help that they need. And that trust hasn't been rebuilt by agencies and by law enforcement or any other services that are needed for our people there on the streets. And it's not surprising then that people aren't going to report it when those relationships and trust haven't been reestablished and haven't been shown to do otherwise.
We talked about this just before we started, about the misidentification of folks, particularly in the case of murder, where the police on the scene will misidentify someone who's been murdered as Asian. Like they'll
use the other box. Yeah.
Yes. Or yeah. And so then in the official record, this was not a murdered Indigenous person. This was a murdered Asian person. Or it's misfiled because particularly when we're talking about these unhoused folks who don't have a driver's license on them, perhaps, or some sort of identification, or there's no one around to identify them.
Yeah. So we go missing in demographic data in a lot of different ways. And that some of the ways is by making assumptions or not being able to have communication, like the families aren't being involved for whatever reasons in many different types of scenarios. And honestly, families are this is a very stressful, traumatic time for families. And who knows their minds are reeling with lots of other things, right?
Their priority is not correcting that particular box.
And I'll also say, from my family's experience, my mother's box was checked as white, and we had to go back and get it changed. And that doesn't necessarily go back and actually change the records. So you can get it changed just for the sake of your family having that, but it doesn't go back and change the data system. And we find that also in maternal child deaths. So for example, if there's a update in a way that they believe someone passed away, they can correct it and change it on that side, but it actually doesn't ultimately go back and get changed in the data for maternal child deaths either, even though we have this fantastic review process. So there's so many ways that folks go missing in data. And we know that those limited 4 boxes are not serving us. And so we do a lot of advocacy. One, we reclaim that information constantly and try to make as accurate as possible to reflect our communities. And we try to advocate for better data systems that truly reflect who we are. And there's lots of different ideas for what that might look like, but having those conversations, because we know that legislators and people who are in positions of making decisions about these issues need accurate information. One of the ones with law enforcement that we advocated really strongly for years was like, how are you even pulling the cases you need to investigate if the cases themselves are being mislabeled or don't reflect those needs? And so we've seen some updates from advocacy around that as well, around what types of cases, and that's promising. But even to serve law enforcement, for them to do their own work, right? It's a benefit to them, not just us as community members, to be reflected truly.
So Aqpik, you brought up a really good point, which is moving towards solutions and giving guidance to law enforcement agencies or asking questions. What do you see as, and this is a question for both of you, the best way forward in terms of addressing this issue?
We have lots of... Kendra and I got recommendations. There's a lot specifically for data. Some of the ones that we have put forward is having better case status, which some of those have been updated minimally and still have a lot more to do. There's a lot around demographic recommendations, including improving those drop-down or checkbox menus, and that could look like lots of different things. And then some of the, besides the data recommendations, one of the ones we've also had is to mandate data entry into the federal database of NamUs. And there's some efforts being put around that. There's an AFN resolution just passed to do that. We've been advocating for that because it's a no cost, quote, low-hanging fruit that we could do that other states have. Other ones that we have recommended are around cultural training for law enforcement. Kendra's been doing great work about that. I'm going to share more. And then I feel like my big pie in the sky ask that I say anytime I get a chance to is to have tribal non-competitive renewed funding for their justice systems. We have so many communities that don't have even basic funds to run their justice system, to even create codes to do all of the many things they want to do in their communities for sovereign, self-determined work and what those solutions could look like. And so I think one of the things we hear all the time is if it would make such a huge difference to have non-competitive renewed funding for them. And we know that the solutions across communities may look very different from one to the other. And so we want to support that self-determination.
Can you dumb it down for me, like the non-competitive renewed funding? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah. So each year, Murkowski does pull a little bit of funds for Alaska Native tribes to have, but she doesn't have to. It's not mandated. We don't have a clear amount of money that's going to tribes to run their justice systems and their courts and to build
this justice,
simple
I'm thinking like
infrastructure.
Small villages having community safety.
Even an administrative person
to just keep
to
track of this.
just do that, or to run the grant simply, or to have their BPSOs or whatever that might look like for them. Yeah.
So think of it in this way, right? We have each tribe has their own sovereign government. This is something that, since time immemorial, like when we've always had our tribal justice systems, that's something they inherently have. So you have your tribal justice systems, you have your state government systems, you got federal governments. And so what's important about our tribal government systems is that, like Aqpik just said, we have 229 federally recognized tribes in the state of Alaska. And so each one of those justice systems might look a little bit different. Historically, we have a little bit more of a restorative type justice system. And so when tribes have their codes, and a lot of these, I should first say, we have a lot of tribal laws that were really passed down through oral, they're unwritten. And we have some of those laws, and they have some codes that they've been developing their own constitution. So it's going to look a little bit different, and their public safety is going to look different too. And some folks might want like a village public safety officer, which is a partnership with the state. Some people might want a tribal police officer. And so there's a lot of different aspects that go into that. And right now, a lot of the funding that we get to support our tribes is coming from the federal government, BIA, and other sources of funding for all tribes, I should say, not just Alaska, but all over. They're competitive grants that are coming in. As you know, through grant cycles, a lot of times you're constantly trying to get grants. You're applying for them. You're having to go through the red tape of reporting and all of that. And so it's not a sustainable funding source. And so it's really hard to, when you're saying you need a position, you need a village public, or you need any kind of public safety officer, you're going to get maybe funding for 1 year. Are you going to get it the next year? I don't know. We'll see how it goes. It's not a sustainable funding source. And so a lot of our tribes are small. And when you're also not only almost like competing with each other within our own state, but you're competing with the rest of our tribes down in the lower 48 and whatnot. So having that sustainable funding to ensure that our tribal justice systems can continue and you're not having to struggle year to year.
There's a lot of technical need for even just doing that.
Right. And I have a question because it's, and maybe there's not an answer, but are there particular areas of Alaska or particular places that need the money more than others? Like,
I wouldn't answer that. I would say that our communities and tribes know best what's going to work for them, and that's going to look like lots of different things. And it wouldn't be fair to say that one needs more than the other. If one community is trying to work on suicide prevention, one community does have an MMIP plan they want to roll out, or if one community is doing something really great with culture camps, it's no one's job to say that need or that want is greater than the other. We honor that self-determination of their decision making in their community for knowing what's best for them.
I guess in terms of just allocating resources, so you would recommend allocating resources equally across the board and then let those people decide, regardless of whether one particular community seems to be having a higher need.
I think that our tribal leadership in all of our communities across the state are going to be able to speak up to say what they need and have been for a long time on lots of different issues, whether it's fishing or all of these things for resources. And they've made their own priorities of what that's going to look like.
One question that I hear a lot, it's not something that I hear being asked out loud so much, but something that gets said. And so forgive me if it sounds like an offensive question, but people say, you know what, the corporations need to step up and be doing more. That we know the Alaska Business Report came out we got it in our boxes yesterday, showing that the most successful corporations in Alaska, and the top 10, like 8 or so of them are Alaska Native corporations. And should their money be playing more of a role in this? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I think, again, talking about the history and the context was important because it also sets the tone for who's being accountable and where the source of violence is coming from. And I think having that be directly said, don't agree with that. I do think there's an opportunity to build relationship and to invite the bridge between the Alaska Native corporations and the grassroots work that we're doing. I think has a lot of opportunity to be developed. But again, I would be weary of saying that because it further silos and makes this, quote, just a Native issue. When we know that even we say violence against women, it should be clear that's a men's issue, right? We saw those stats on perpetrators. We know that the majority of where this comes from is 1, not Native, and 2, not women, right? And yet it's women, Native women, who are often doing the work. And so I think just like making sure the reframe of where the accountability lies is important. You can say something different, Kendra, if you want. That's my own reply.
As we get to the end of our time, can you let folks know where they can get more information, how they can get involved in being part of the solution?
Yeah, and I think important thing I want to say, it's partnerships with everybody and how we're addressing the issues here. It's public safety. Our state has the responsibility to ensure public safety for all of Alaska, not just our urban centers. So we have a huge state. You need to address public safety across the entire state. That's their inherent responsibility to take care of all Alaskans, right? And also it's for the legislature. You're appropriating budgets to to public safety and to mental health and to all these things that need to be taken care of, having to look at what's being offered in urban and rural areas and what's partnerships with tribes and our corporations of how do we address this together as Alaskans and ensure that we are protecting, all of Alaskans. And that's going to be through mental health services, it's going to be public safety, it's going to be all these different things. And there's many levels on how to do that. It's sustainable funding and it's also going to be looking at policy solutions. Aqpik talked about some of the data things, but what can you do on the policy side? We now have over advocating since 2018 for MMIP investigators. We now have 4 in the state at DPS because we've been sending letters every year since we've been doing this together of here are a list of ideas that you can do. And so now we have our 4 MMIP investigators and they're incredibly busy. It's sad that we're keeping them so busy with all the MMIP cases, but that's something that the state was able to do, is to continue supporting those investigators. It's continuing to ensure resources that our tribes are doing. Reach out to our tribes and say, what do you need in your community? What is it that you can do? And that's, I think, on our policymakers on the federal and the state level of how do we increase those partnerships and provide the resources that are needed. I think that's a lot of things. And what can we do to advocate? It might be, for example, there's an MMIP bill that Senator Olson has put in. That's something that individuals can do is reach out to your legislator and talk to them. Say, hey, we need this. Senate Bill 151 is an important piece of how we can address MMIP. Budget items, I think, is important. Like I said, supporting the Village Public Safety Officer program, ensuring that we are getting more rural public safety, investing in the 911 system. We have a terrible 911 system in Alaska. We need infrastructure. Basic internet, what you need, not only just to host meetings, but it's important to be able to access programs and to have a lot of different access throughout Alaska and things like broadband. Those are things that I think is important to share. What can people do is share what's happening in their community, what those needs are, and making sure that we're telling your legislators and our tribal leaders are coming in. So just using your voice, sharing those stories, and having our legislators and policymakers and tribal leaders listen and really listen to what those are and putting those into action. And so that's a lot of what we've been doing too with the MIW work group is we work on every front. It's about healing and community. We hear a lot of stories from families and we're taking that information, finding what those loopholes and with their permission, sharing so we can address what that is. And it's awareness. We have a 5K awareness run every year. We have policy forums. We've gone to the legislature to present on MIP and public safety. And we do this every year. And I remember when we went into the Anchorage Assembly, it was a few years ago, and they said, this is the first presentation we've ever had on MMIP. Anchorage is one of the highest rates of MMIP in the nation. And so it's not just a rural issue.
That's the point I was going to make, is that I think that's what gets lost a lot. Again, is that people say this is not Anchorage's issue. This is a rural Alaska issue. And I think that's a huge misconception. Aqpik, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, just what Kendra is sharing, and she's been doing really great work corresponding and going back and forth and getting those bills in there. And we also let communities know that when this is a systemic issue, it requires systemic solutions. And that means that everyone, no matter what role you have, can be a part of the solution, whether that's media, doing a walk or run in your community, putting forward a resolution for the city you live in. We love to share information like that. There's a community toolkit that the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center created. We have a resource page. We have a website. And so we really like to just share what we've been up to so that others can do it and make it easier for them, and also uplift that there's so many other tribes and other groups doing really important work. We have a federal coordinator, Ingrid Cumberledge, we didn't even mention. She's been doing great work up here in Alaska. The AVCP has also put out really great direct services information. And so just uplifting all of the work that's being done across the state by families. Unfortunately, families are still carrying a lot of the weight and advocating for themselves and doing really important work too. And so we just want to uplift them as well and know that everyone can bring something to the table and being a part of the solution. I've told people, if you have DJ skills, you can donate them to one of our events, and that's contributing. And it really makes a difference. And so we invite everyone to step into a space where they're able to, if they want to work on this with us.
And are there any books that you can recommend? I know I'm just dropping it on you.
Actually, thank you for that. The Alaska Native Women's Resource Center just put out a new book, which is amazing because it's really looking at violence against women from the Indigenous perspective. That's available on Amazon. Contact us at the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. We're working on a book launch, actually.
In November.
And there's also lots of other resources, I think, too, of checking out our webpage, MMWIG2S Alaska.org. And we have a Facebook page where we're sharing out resources that Aqpik mentioned. You can look at the different organizations that are involved, but we're constantly updating our website. So it's putting out more resources, putting more information in there, toolkits. So like Aqpik said, if you want to, for whatever people want to do, maybe they want to sponsor a run or maybe they want to do something in their community, we can help partner in doing that work and also put people in touch with what's happening.
I will drop links to the websites and to the book in the show notes so folks can access them there. Thank you both so much for being on the show today.
Koyana for having us.
I have included links to the websites mentioned, as well as a link to the book Alaska Native Women, Ending the Violence, Reclaiming a Sacred Status. Thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com. That's East Anchorage Book Club, all one word, @gmail.com.
Cheers.